Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our colloquium. Our speaker today is Professor Adam Winkler. Many of you may have seen him on television, heard him on the radio, or read his work in leading publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's a graduate of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the NYU Law School. He's a professor of constitutional law at UCLA. And he's the author of How American Business, We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights, which was named a finalist for both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He's also written Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and many of you have seen him speak about the Second Amendment publicly as well. He's one of the 20 most heavily cited law professors by the courts of the United States and states. And so we're really honored to have him here today. And in answer to the most compelling question that I know you have, he is not related to Henry Winkler. But he is related to Irwin Winkler, his father, who is one of the great producers in the history of Hollywood. So with that, I will give you Professor Winkler.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to use this. It's true, I'm not related to Henry Winkler, but I did once run into him at a restaurant, and I was introduced, and I said, you know, my whole life, everyone's always asked me, are you related to Henry Winkler? And he looked at me and he laughed, and he says, that's the most amazing thing. And I said, why? He says, because my whole life, people have asked me, am I related to Adam Winkler? So he's a Menchie guy. We like him. So corporations have been at the center of some of the biggest Supreme Court cases in recent years. In 2010, in the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court held that corporations have the same free speech right as individuals and can spend their money freely on campaign ads. Now, some people think that Citizens United will lead to a corporate takeover of American democracy. Well, oh, come on, that's silly. We all know corporations took over American democracy a long time ago. Come on. In 2014, in the Hobby Lobby case, the Supreme Court held that the chain of craft stores, a corporation, had religious liberty under a federal statute and entitled the company to an exemption from a rule requiring large employers to cover employee birth control and employee health plans. The issue of corporate rights has also come up just more recently this past term in a case called Masterpiece Cake Shop, which involved a baker who refused to sell a wedding cake to a same-sex couple. And the Supreme Court in that case held that the corporation, Masterpiece Cake Shop, was protected and had First Amendment religious liberty rights. So how did corporations come to have our most fundamental rights? Obviously, they don't march in the street with signs saying corporations are people too. But like women and minorities who did march for their rights, corporations have also fought in the Supreme Court for over 200 years to win rulings recognizing the fundamental rights of business corporations. Indeed, today corporations have nearly all the same rights as you and me, rights they use to challenge laws that regulate business and regulate the economy. In law school today, students learn about civil rights, women's rights, states' rights even. But there's also been a 200-year battle for corporate rights that's taken place in the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the first thing to know about the fight for constitutional rights for corporations is that the fight's been going on for a very long time. The first Supreme Court case on the rights of African Americans under the Constitution was the Dred Scott case, decided in 1857. The first Supreme Court case on the rights of women under the Constitution, Bradwell versus Illinois, wasn't decided until the 1870s. The first Supreme Court case on whether business corporations had rights under the Constitution Constitution was decided much earlier, a half-century earlier, back in 1809. And the bank involved, the corporation involved, was the richest and most powerful corporation in America, the Bank of the United States. At the time when most corporations were highly local, the Bank of the United States was the first truly national corporation we had in America, with branches from Boston all the way down to New Orleans. Now, the Bank of the United States is famous for giving rise to the two competing political parties as the framers split over policies related to the Bank of the United States. So we can credit the Bank of the United States for giving us, of course, the memorable rap battle in Hamilton the musical. So that's a good thing. But the Bank of the United States was despised by Jeffersonians, and Jeffersonians were determined to kill the bank by any means necessary. And Jeffersonians in Georgia passed a law taxing the Bank of the United States. And the bank wanted to fight back. And the bank didn't want to sue in Georgia state courts because they thought the Georgia state courts would likely favor the Georgia law and wouldn't favor this out of state bank. And so the Bank of the United States filed suit instead in federal court. And the bank's case raised a familiar question. Are corporations people? Or more specifically, are corporations citizens under Article 3 of the Constitution? This provision of the Constitution effectively gives people a right to sue in federal court when they sue citizens of other states. And the framers put this clause in the Constitution in part because they feared that states would be sort of beholden to local interests. And if someone's going to be sued in Georgia courts who's from Philadelphia, well, that Philadelphia person should be able to go to federal court instead. And the bank said it would be subject to these same prejudices too. And the bank, which was headquartered in Philadelphia, thought it would have a better chance in federal court. Now, when the framers wrote this provision of the Constitution, they were not thinking about corporations. They referred to controversies between citizens of different states. And we know that the framers harbored considerable hostility towards business corporations. And indeed, one of the famous acts of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, was in part a revolt against a business corporation. We often remember it as a revolt against the British government. But it was also there was a corporation that was also the target of the attack at the harbor in Boston. And that corporation was the East India Company. At the time, one of the most powerful corporations in the world. But the East India Company in the early 1770s suffered a great financial crisis. And all of the major banks of Europe were all heavily invested in the East India Company stock. And so the British government passed a bailout of the East India Company. And as part of that bailout, it gave the East India Company the right, for the very first time, to sell tea in the colonies without having to use American middlemen. So the revolt that day was not because the price of tea was going up, the price of tea was going down. They were cutting out a middleman, but they were cutting out the American middlemen. And so the Boston Tea Party was a group of American merchants who went out and protested against that corporation. And the reason why the boat that was chosen and the tea that was thrown overboard was chosen was because it belonged to the East India Company. Now, despite the fact that the framers never considered whether corporations should have rights under the Constitution, in the Bank of the United States case, when it went to the Supreme Court, the legendary Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the Bank of the United States. Marshall did not say that corporations had the right to sue as such. He didn't say corporations were citizens as such. He said corporations had the right to sue in federal court under Article 3 because their members were citizens. And to protect the rights of the members, we had to give the right to the corporation. The very first Supreme Court case to grant a constitutional protection to a business corporation, Bank of the United States versus DeVoe, is one of the hidden landmarks of American jurisprudence. You won't find it in any textbook or mentioned in any constitutional law class, but yet it laid the foundation for 200 years of corporate rights cases to come. Oh, and by the way, Article 3 of the Constitution, the one that was involved in that Bank of the United States case, that was also what was at issue in the Dred Scott case, the first Supreme Court case on the rights of African Americans. The Supreme Court in Dred Scott held that African Americans could not be citizens under that same provision of the Constitution, and they did not have any right to sue in federal court. Unlike racial minorities, however, business corporations did have rights the white man was bound to respect. Corporations have also been innovators in constitutional law and have often won constitutional rights through questionable means. An important and telling example comes out of a remarkable series of cases brought in the 1880s by the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. At the time, a very wealthy and powerful corporation that influenced politics in California. And when California lawmakers imposed a special tax on railroad property, the Southern Pacific Railroad decided to fight back and assembled an all-star team of lawyers to represent them. Now, lawyers have always played a starring role in civil rights litigation. We think about Thurgood Marshall in the civil rights movement, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the women's rights movement. Any movement that seeks to win rights in the Supreme Court needs excellent lawyers to be creative, to come up with great arguments, to persuade the justices. And corporate rights were no exception. Over the course of American history, some of the great lawyers who argued for the rights of business corporations included the legendary Daniel Webster, considered one of the greatest orators in American history, who argued more than 200 cases in the Supreme Court at a time when many of the provisions were just first being interpreted. Many of his clients were corporations. The sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, represented in the Supreme Court, argued for the rights of corporations. And today, in the elite Supreme Court bar, the dean of that bar is probably Ted Olson, who's also argued for the rights of business corporations. Unlike traditional civil rights organizations that throughout history have always struggled for financing and resources, corporations have always had the resources to hire the best, most experienced lawyers money can buy. The dream team put together by the Southern Pacific Railroad included a former justice on the California Supreme Court, one of the nation's leading law professors, and a former candidate for the presidential nomination. But even with those illustrious lawyers, none of them compared with the Southern Pacific's lead lawyer, a man by the name of Roscoe Conkling. Conkling for many years was one of the leaders of the Republican Party in Washington at a time after the Civil War when the Republican Party really dominated Washington politics. He was nominated to the Supreme Court himself, turning down the seat after having won confirmation. He remains, by the way, the last person to this day to turn down a Supreme Court seat after they've won confirmation. He won confirmation easily, but he decided he wouldn't serve, and he was pretty frank about his reasons why. He was simply making too much money as a lawyer for the railroads. Now, Conkling and the lawyers for the Southern Pacific first decided on a strategy of civil disobedience. They would refuse to pay the California tax, and in county after county after county, they refused to pay. And then, many years, 50 years before, or 60 years before the NAACP launched its famous series of test cases to try to overturn racial segregation in schools, the Southern Pacific Railroad launched what its lawyers called a series of, quote, test cases, more than 60 of them in all, seeking to expand the constitutional rights of business corporations. And like the NAACP in the racial segregation context, the Southern Pacific Railroad also focused its litigation effort on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which provides that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The railroad said that this tax, by taxing railroad property but not the property of others, was a violation of equal protection of the laws. the important issues that were coming before the Supreme Court when the Southern Pacific Railroad's case came before the justices in the 1880s was captured in this newspaper headline, Civil Rights of Corporations. And Roscoe Conkling went before the Supreme Court, and he argued that the 14th Amendment protected the rights of business corporations, too. Now, everyone knew that the 14th Amendment was adopted after the Civil War to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves. But Conkling said that it was also written to protect business corporations. Conkling had, it was an audacious argument, but Conkling did have unusual credibility on this issue. He could argue before the Supreme Court as a peer, right? They thought of him as someone who could be sitting among them. He had been confirmed to the court himself. But even more than that, Conkling, when he was a young congressman, had sat on the very committee that had written the 14th Amendment. So when he was telling the justices about the intent of the framers of the 14th Amendment, he was speaking about his own experience. And he told the justices that when the committee was deliberating the 14th Amendment, they were also concerned about protecting business corporations, and indeed that the text of the 14th Amendment had been changed. It had originally been written to provide equal protection for citizens, but that language had been changed so there'd be no confusion that corporations were covered too, to persons, because for many legal reasons, corporations have often been thought of as persons. Conkling even produced a musty old journal that he said was a never-before-published record of the deliberations of the drafting committee of the 14th Amendment. And he said, if you look at this journal, it's going to prove my argument about how we were focused on business corporations too, which was quite a surprise since no one ever thought about business corporations being protected by the 14th Amendment when it was ratified and adopted. We now know that historians have gone through the evidence quite closely, and as one historian concluded, Conkling engaged in a, quote, brazen, deliberate forgery to win new rights for corporations. We now know that when we've gone through the history of the drafting of the 14th Amendment, that business corporations were never mentioned in any of the ratification debates, never mentioned by any of the drafters of the committee before Roscoe Conkling stood before the justices that day. So Conkling's case, however, they never issued a final ruling in Roscoe Conkling's case. They held on to it for about 3 years, and some speculated that it was due to a procedural snafu, but I think what happened was that Conkling's fraud on the court was uncovered. But part of the reason why it didn't matter that much in some ways was because just about a year later, the Supreme Court heard another one of the 60 test cases brought by the Southern Pacific Railroad, this time raising the exact same issues. Do corporations have rights of equal protection under the 14th Amendment? But this time there's no Conkling, no mention of his journal, and no mention of the drafting history of the 14th Amendment, just a straightforward argument about how corporations need these rights too. And in that case, the Supreme Court, in the second Southern Pacific Railroad case, the Supreme Court rules for the railroad. But the court says specifically we're not ruling on the constitutional question. We can settle this case by a statutory issue, and we will leave for another day the question of whether corporations have rights under the 14th Amendment. But then the Southern Pacific Railroad's test cases took a bizarre turn, another bizarre turn perhaps. The court's opinions are published in official volumes known as the United States Report, and they're edited by someone known as the Reporter of Decisions. And the Reporter of Decisions, by tradition, writes up a summary of the Supreme Court's opinion and publishes it in with the volumes. And this makes legal research easier. You can open it up, read the syllabus really quickly, close it up if you don't need to read that case, or read the case if you decide you need to. And the Reporter of Decisions back in the 1880s, when the Southern Pacific Railroad's cases were heard, was a man named J.C. Bancroft Davis. And Davis included a very unusual headnote and syllabus in the Southern Pacific Railway case. He wrote in the syllabus, you can't see it from your view perhaps, but he wrote that the court had held that the defendant corporations were persons under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and had equal protection rights, something that the Supreme Court had specifically said in the opinion we weren't reaching. The court was not deciding that issue. Now, we don't know why Bancroft Davis put this inaccurate summary and syllabus in front of this case, but if you're one for conspiracy theories, you might be interested to know that he was the former president of the Newburgh and New York Railway Company. Justice Stephen Field, one of the most colorful justices ever to be on the Supreme Court, saw the potential posed by this inaccurate headnote. Now, Field was the first justice from the Wild West, first from California. He was reputed to carry a gun with him everywhere he went, even under his robes. And he is, if you've never heard of him, he's definitely worth looking up. He's the only Supreme Court justice to be arrested while he was sitting on the Supreme Court. And the crime was murder. Now, of course he was innocent. I mean, he was a Supreme Court justice. You get other people to do that for you. He was innocent, of course, but we could perhaps say he was guilty of one thing, which was being absolutely determined to expand the 14th Amendment rights of business corporations. A close confidant of Leland Stanford, the head of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and indeed one of the original trustees of Stanford University, Leland Stanford University in Palo Alto, Stephen Field wrote an opinion on the same day that the Supreme Court decided the Southern Pacific Railway case, where he said, hey, my colleagues, you're not doing your duty. We need to answer this really important constitutional question. The businessmen of America need to know whether their rights are protected too. But a couple years later, he's writing a majority opinion, Field, and he just drops in a sentence that, oh, as we held in the Southern Pacific Railway case, corporations are protected by the 14th Amendment. Something that he knew the court hadn't held. He had complained that the court hadn't held that in that case. And indeed, after Justice Field's notation of the Southern Pacific Railway case, that Southern Pacific Railroad case would be cited over and over and over again by courts for holding that corporations have rights under the 14th Amendment, a proposition the court specifically refused to decide in that case. Now, one reason why Field was able to get away with his sleight of hand was because the court at the time was entering into a period of its history where it was known to be very, very business-friendly. It was a period in the court's history known as the Lochner Era, lasting roughly from 1890 to 1937. And during this period, the court broadly read the Constitution to favor the rights of business, to strike down business regulation, including things like maximum hours laws, minimum wage laws, zoning laws, even laws regulating the commercial weight of bread. The court was very active in that period, reading the Constitution to favor business. Meanwhile, during those same years, in the 1890s, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy against Ferguson that separate but equal Jim Crow laws were constitutionally permissible, reading the 14th Amendment very narrowly in the context of African Americans. And indeed, a law librarian conducted a study of all the 14th Amendment cases decided by the United States Supreme Court between 1868, when it was ratified, and 1912, when he was doing this study. And he found that of all those 14th Amendment cases decided by the Supreme Court, there had been a grand total of 28 cases on the rights of African Americans, the intended beneficiaries of the 14th Amendment, and an astonishing 312 cases on the rights of business corporations. The 14th Amendment, adopted as a shield for the newly freed slaves against discriminatory laws, had been turned into a sword used by business corporations to strike down regulation of the economy. Now, one interesting thing about the Lochner Court, it was very business-friendly, but that period also saw the court introduce the first limits on the rights of business corporations, too, explicitly in the Constitution. The court, in a 1905 case, said that corporations are entitled to property rights under the Constitution, right? Their property should be protected, but that corporations weren't entitled to liberty rights under the Constitution, rights that were associated with personal autonomy, bodily integrity, or conscience, or political participation. Indeed, in a case kind of evocative of the same-sex wedding case that the Supreme Court heard this past term, the Supreme Court back in the first decade of the 20th century held that a business corporation did not have a right to refuse service to customers it didn't want to do business with. The case at issue involved the Tanforan racetrack, and the company that ran the Tanforan Tanforan Racetrack up in Northern California. Tanforan Racetrack, later home of the famous Seabiscuit. Tanforan Racetrack wanted to challenge a California law that required places of public amusement to serve anyone with a valid ticket. It was an early anti-discrimination law, right? If someone has a ticket, they get to come in, you don't get to discriminate against them. But the Tanforan Racetrack didn't want to abide by that law, and so they challenged it and went to court and said, this is a violation of our freedom of association, that forcing us to have a customer on our track that we don't want is the equivalent of forcing a private guest, an unwanted guest, into a private reception. The Supreme Court, however, back then rejected the corporation's argument, finding that the right of association was the right of personal liberty, not a property right belonging to the corporation. In another instance of deja vu, in the 19-teens, brewing companies like the Lansing Brewing Company here filed suit challenging campaign finance laws that restricted corporate money in elections, 100 years before Citizens United. At issue in those were some of the early campaign finance laws which limited corporate money in elections, adopted right around the turn of the century. And the alcohol interest didn't like this law in the run-up to Prohibition in the 19-teens, right? We outlawed alcohol and Prohibition. In the run-up to Prohibition, they wanted to take out ads and campaign against going dry. And so they challenged campaign finance laws in that period. But the courts in that period consistently upheld the campaign finance laws, saying that rights to participate in politics are the kinds of rights that belong to natural persons, not to artificial persons. Corporations, I said earlier, corporations have been innovators. One of the ways in which they've been innovative in constitutional law is helping to breathe life into important constitutional provisions. That you might think that when corporations gain rights, they only gain those rights after individuals have won them. But in fact, some of the most important cases where the Supreme Court decides to finally give teeth to a constitutional right have been brought by business corporations. A good example of this comes from the 1930s, and media corporations, in particular newspapers, that challenged censorship by Huey Long, the kingfish. If you're not familiar with Huey Long, he was the governor of Louisiana. Confirmation easily, but he decided he wouldn't serve, and he was pretty frank about his reasons why. He was simply making too much money as a lawyer for the railroads. Now, Conkling and the lawyers for the Southern Pacific first decided on a strategy of civil disobedience. They would refuse to pay the California tax, and in county after county after county, they refused to pay. And then, many years, 50 years before, or 60 years before the NAACP launched its famous series of test cases to try to overturn racial segregation in schools, the Southern Pacific Railroad launched what its lawyers called a series of, quote, test cases, more than 60 of them in all, seeking to expand the constitutional rights of business corporations. And like the NAACP in the racial segregation context, the Southern Pacific Railroad also focused its litigation effort on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which provides that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The railroad said that this tax, by taxing railroad property but not the property of others, was a violation of equal protection of the laws. The important issues that were coming before the Supreme Court when the Southern Pacific Railroad's case came before the justices in the 1880s was captured in this newspaper headline, Civil Rights of Corporations. And Roscoe Conkling went before the Supreme Court, and he argued that the 14th Amendment protected the rights of business corporations too. Now, everyone knew that the 14th Amendment was adopted after the Civil War to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves. But Conkling said that it was also written to protect business corporations. Conkling had, it was an audacious argument, but Conkling did have unusual credibility on this issue. He could argue before the Supreme Court as a peer, right? They thought of him as someone who could be sitting among them. He had been confirmed to the court himself. But even more than that, Conkling, when he was a young congressman, had sat on the very committee that had written the 14th Amendment. So when he was telling the justices about the intent of the framers of the 14th Amendment, he was speaking about his own experience. And he told the justices that when the committee was deliberating the 14th Amendment, they were also concerned about protecting business corporations, and indeed that the text of the 14th Amendment had been changed. It had originally been written to provide equal protection for citizens, but that language had been changed so there'd be no confusion that corporations were covered too, to persons, because for many legal reasons, corporations have often been thought of as persons. Conkling even produced a musty old journal that he said was a never-before-published record of the deliberations of the drafting committee of the 14th Amendment. And he said, if you look at this journal, it's going to prove my argument about how we were focused on business corporations too, which was quite a surprise since no one ever thought about business corporations being protected by the 14th Amendment when it was ratified and adopted. We now know that historians have gone through the evidence quite closely, and as one historian concluded, Conkling engaged in a, quote, brazen, deliberate forgery to win new rights for corporations. We now know that when we've gone through the history of the drafting of the 14th Amendment, that business corporations were never mentioned in any of the ratification debates, never mentioned by any of the drafters of the committee before Roscoe Conkling stood before the justices that day. So Conkling's case, however, they never issued a final ruling in Roscoe Conkling's case. They held on to it for about 3 years, and some speculated that it was due to a procedural snafu, but I think what happened was that Conkling's fraud on the court was uncovered. But part of the reason why it didn't matter that much in some ways was because just about a year later, the Supreme Court heard another one of the 60 test cases brought by the Southern Pacific Railroad, this time raising the exact same issues. Do corporations have rights of equal protection under the 14th Amendment? But this time there's no Conkling, no mention of his journal, and no mention of the drafting history of the 14th Amendment, just a straightforward argument about how corporations need these rights too. And in that case, the Supreme Court, in the second Southern Pacific Railroad case, the Supreme Court rules for the railroad. But the court says specifically we're not ruling on the constitutional question. We can settle this case by a statutory issue, and we will leave for another day the question of whether corporations have rights under the 14th Amendment. But then the Southern Pacific Railroad's test cases took a bizarre turn, another bizarre turn perhaps. The court's opinions are published in official volumes known as the United States Report, and they're edited by someone known as the Reporter of Decisions. And the Reporter of Decisions, by tradition, writes up a summary of the Supreme Court's opinion and publishes it in with the volumes. And this makes legal research easier. You can open it up, read the syllabus really quickly, close it up if you don't need to read that case, or read the case if you decide you need to. And the Reporter of Decisions back in the 1880s, when the Southern Pacific Railroad's cases were heard, was a man named J.C. Bancroft Davis. And Davis included a very unusual headnote and syllabus in the Southern Pacific Railway case. He wrote in the syllabus, you can't see it from your view perhaps, but he wrote that the court had held that the defendant corporations were persons under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and had equal protection rights, something that the Supreme Court had specifically said in the opinion we weren't reaching. The court was not deciding that issue. Now, we don't know why Bancroft Davis put this inaccurate summary and syllabus in front of this case, but if you're one for conspiracy theories, you might be interested to know that he was the former president of the Newburgh and New York Railway Company. Justice Stephen Field, one of the most colorful justices ever to be on the Supreme Court, saw the potential posed by this inaccurate headnote. Now, Field was the first justice from the Wild West, first from California. He was reputed to carry a gun with him everywhere he went, even under his robes. And he is, if you've never heard of him, he's definitely worth looking up. He is the only Supreme Court justice to be arrested while he was sitting on the Supreme Court. And the crime was murder. Now, of course he was innocent. I mean, he was a Supreme Court justice. You get other people to do that for you. He was innocent, of course, but we could perhaps say he was guilty of one thing, which was being absolutely determined to expand the 14th Amendment rights of business corporations. A close confidant of Leland Stanford, the head of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and indeed one of the original trustees of Stanford University, Leland Stanford University in Palo Alto, Stephen Field wrote an opinion on the same day that the Supreme Court decided the Southern Pacific Railway case, where he said, hey, my colleagues, you're not doing your duty. We need to answer this really important constitutional question. The businessmen of America need to know whether their rights are protected too. But a couple years later, he's writing a majority opinion, Field, and he just drops in a sentence that, oh, as we held in the Southern Pacific Railway case, corporations are protected by the 14th Amendment. Something that he knew the court hadn't held. He had complained that the court hadn't held that in that case. And indeed, after Justice Field's notation of the Southern Pacific Railway case, that Southern Pacific Railroad case would be cited over and over and over again by courts for holding that corporations have rights under the 14th Amendment, a proposition the court specifically refused to decide in that case. Now, one reason why Field was able to get away with his sleight of hand was because the court at the time was entering into a period of its history where it was known to be very, very business-friendly. It was a period in the court's history known as the Lochner Era, lasting roughly from 1890 to 1937. And during this period, the court broadly read the Constitution to favor the rights of business, to strike down business regulation, including things like maximum hours laws, minimum wage laws, zoning laws, even laws regulating the commercial weight of bread. The court was very active in that period, reading the Constitution to favor business. Meanwhile, during those same years, in the 1890s, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy against Ferguson that separate but equal Jim Crow laws were constitutionally permissible, reading the 14th Amendment very narrowly in the context of African Americans. And indeed, a law librarian conducted a study of all the 14th Amendment cases decided by the United States Supreme Court between 1868, when it was ratified, and 1912, when he was doing this study. And he found that of all those 14th Amendment cases decided by the Supreme Court, there had been a grand total of 28 cases on the rights of African Americans, the intended beneficiaries of the 14th Amendment, and an astonishing 312 cases on the rights of business corporations. The 14th Amendment, adopted as a shield for the newly freed slaves against discriminatory laws, had been turned into a sword used by business corporations to strike down regulation of the economy. Now, one interesting thing about the Lochner Court, it was very business-friendly, but that period also saw the court introduce the first limits on the rights of business corporations, too, explicitly in the Constitution. The court, in a 1905 case, said that corporations are entitled to property rights under the Constitution, right? Their property should be protected, but that corporations weren't entitled to liberty rights under the Constitution, rights that were associated with personal autonomy, bodily integrity, or conscience, or political participation. Indeed, in a case kind of evocative of the same-sex wedding case that the Supreme Court heard this past term, the Supreme Court back in the first decade of the 20th century held that a business corporation did not have a right to refuse service to customers it didn't want to do business with. The case at issue involved the Tanforan Racetrack and the company that ran the Tanforan Racetrack up in Northern California. Tanforan Racetrack, later home of the famous Seabiscuit. Tanforan Racetrack wanted to challenge a California law that required places of public amusement to serve anyone with a valid ticket. It was an early anti-discrimination law, right? If someone has a ticket, they get to come in, you don't get to discriminate against them. But the Tanforan Racetrack didn't want to abide by that law, and so they challenged it and went to court and said, this is a violation of our freedom of association, that forcing us to have a customer on our track that we don't want is the equivalent of forcing a private guest, an unwanted guest, into a private reception. The Supreme Court, however, back then rejected the corporation's argument, finding that the right of association was the right of personal liberty, not a property right belonging to the corporation. In another instance of deja vu, in the 19-teens, brewing companies like the Lansing Brewing Company here filed suit challenging campaign finance laws that restricted corporate money in elections, 100 years before Citizens United. At issue in those were some of the early campaign finance laws which limited corporate money in elections, adopted right around the turn of the century. And the alcohol interest didn't like this law in the run-up to Prohibition in the 19-teens, right? We outlawed alcohol and Prohibition. In the run-up to Prohibition, they wanted to take out ads and campaign against going dry. And so they challenged campaign finance laws in that period. But the courts in that period consistently upheld the campaign finance laws, saying that rights to participate in politics are the kinds of rights that belong to natural persons, not to artificial persons. Corporations, I said earlier, corporations have been innovators. One of the ways in which they've been innovative in constitutional law is helping to breathe life into important constitutional provisions. That you might think that when corporations gain rights, they only gain those rights after individuals have won them. But in fact, some of the most important cases where the Supreme Court decides to finally give teeth to a constitutional right have been brought by business corporations. A good example of this comes from the 1930s and media corporations, in particular newspapers, that challenged censorship by Huey Long, the Kingfish. If you're not familiar with Huey Long, he was the governor of Louisiana. He won election on the eve of the Great Depression, promising to make Louisiana great again. And he had that same kind of, he was kind of Trump before Trump, had that same kind of boisterous populism behind him. And when the media came out against his program, he accused the media of publishing fake news. You can't make this up. It's and his allies in the Louisiana state legislature passed a law that imposed a tax on the advertising revenue of the big newspapers. And the newspapers wanted to challenge that tax in court, but the law was kind of on Long's side. Because up till then, the Supreme Court had said that the freedom of the press, guaranteed by the First Amendment, was only a protection against prior restraints, prior censorship. That it was okay to put incidental burdens on speech or even to punish speech after the fact. You just couldn't restrain it in advance. But this tax, which was a small amount, really wasn't a restraint on their speech. It was just a burden. But nonetheless, in this case brought by these Louisiana newspapers, the Supreme Court held for the first time that the freedom of the press protects against any form of censorship, whether it's a prior restraint or not. And corporations were entitled to claim that right too. Today, in a modern society, corporations publish the newspapers that play an important role in encouraging democratic debate and in checking the government. Indeed, throughout the 20th century, many of the most important First Amendment cases ever decided by the Supreme Court involved business corporations. Think of New York Times Company versus Sullivan that recognized the right to criticize public officials without fear of libel. Or perhaps the Pentagon Papers case, where the Washington Post Company and the New York Times Company went against the government so that they could publish the Pentagon Papers. In fact, even if you oppose the rights of corporations, you may have seen this movie on the Pentagon Papers case, The Post, right? Well, if you did, probably at the end, you were probably rooting for a business corporation asserting its First Amendment rights. Now, corporations won a greater sphere of First Amendment rights even after the Louisiana case, and won more of the rights that we associate with personal liberty beginning in the 1970s. And one of the surprisingly influential people who helped lead that charge, unwittingly perhaps, was Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, the famed crusader for consumer rights in the 1970s, was at the peak of his power, right? And Nader Nader pushed for consumer protection laws, clean air laws, environmental laws, and whatnot. And at this period, it was Nader brought a lawsuit to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of consumers, and his case was designed to protect the rights of consumers to get access to information from pharmacists. The law at issue was a restriction on the ability of pharmacists to advertise prescription drug prices. So depending on which pharmacy you go to, you'd end up paying a lot more for your prescription drugs. And you couldn't comparison shop because there was no advertising allowed. And so Nader said, well, that's crazy. People are overpaying for their prescription meds. So he sued to challenge this law that restricted the pharmacist's ability to advertise on behalf of consumers. And he won that case, and his case established some very important First Amendment principles that would subsequently be used much more by business corporations than they would by consumers. So one of those principles is that the idea that commercial speech, that speech about advertising and commercial matters generally, is protected by the First Amendment. For many years, the Supreme Court had said that commercial speech was not protected by the First Amendment at all, and the government could regulate commercial speech and advertising as it wished. That changed because of Nader's case. Nader was the first Supreme Court case to say, no, speech about advertising is protected by the First Amendment. Indeed, in the years since Nader's victory, this commercial speech doctrine has been used by corporations, by tobacco companies to strike down graphic warnings on cigarette labels, by alcohol and liquor companies challenging advertising restrictions, by companies challenging things like disclosure of conflict minerals and securities laws, all sorts of restrictions. In fact, a recent study found that today, 50% of all First Amendment cases brought in the federal courts today are brought by business corporations or the trade associations that represent them. And many of these cases are commercial speech cases chafing against these regulation of advertising. Indeed, the head of Ralph Nader's organization, Public Citizen, recently came out and called for the entire line of commercial speech cases to be overturned, a kind of poignant version of constitutional buyer's regret, perhaps. Nader's case in the Supreme Court also would establish another important principle, one that would be used eventually to expand the rights of business corporations to spend their money on politics. To understand this story, I'll take you first to Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell, Jr. was a Supreme Court justice. He was appointed by Richard Nixon, and just months before he joined the United States Supreme Court, he penned a memo to the Chamber of Commerce outlining what he called the attack on the American free enterprise system. And his memo was about how Ralph Nader and these consumer rights activists and the leftists were destroying America and destroying the free market, and it was time for business interests to fight back, to make their voices heard, and to fight to protect the free market. This Powell memorandum is generally seen by historians of that era as being a very influential memorandum that, when it was shared by businessmen around the country, sort of got people, it became sort of a strategy plan and a motivating force for many. And in a case decided in the mid-1970s, right after Ralph Nader's victory in the Virginia pharmacy case, Lewis Powell had the chance to turn his memorandum into constitutional law. At issue was a Massachusetts law that restricted corporations from spending their money on referendum campaigns. When the Supreme Court decided it, when the Supreme Court justices met behind closed doors, they decided this law was too broad. The particular law had some quirks in it that some of the justices objected to, and it looked like there would be a very narrow ruling striking down the law, but not saying anything about the rights of business corporations. But then one of the justices writes a memo to the others, and he says, it's Justice Brennan, he writes a memo to the others saying, hey, I think that we really need to address this big issue about about the rights of corporations and whatnot. I don't think we can really avoid it. This other argument we had, it doesn't really work. And the other justices kind of agree. And what happens is a bunch of justices say, well, if we're going to rule on that issue, I'm not going to rule in favor of corporations having these broad political speech rights. And Lewis Powell manages to save his majority in that case by using an argument that Ralph Nader had made in the pharmacy case. Because I remember I told you that Ralph Nader was representing consumers, not a pharmacist, right? He wasn't representing pharmacists. So technically his plaintiffs, the parties he represented, his clients, their speech wasn't restricted by anything, right? The law banned pharmacists from advertising, not individuals from advertising. So he had argued in that case that the consumers of the speech had First Amendment interests too, and that the rights of listeners were protected by the First Amendment, regardless of the identity of the speaker or whether the speaker had any rights to speak at all. The Supreme Court accepted that listeners' rights argument in the Ralph Nader case. And then that's the argument that Lewis Powell uses in the Massachusetts case to hold on to his majority and keep the justices on board. And the court, 30 years before Citizens United, says that corporations have free speech rights because listeners, the people of Massachusetts, have an interest in hearing what those corporations have to say. By the way, that listeners' rights theory would be the central argument, too, in Citizens United. Citizens United does not say anything about corporations or people. Instead, it says that this campaign finance law restricting corporate speech in elections is unconstitutional because it restricts the rights of the listeners, of the people who would want to hear what the speech is. With the financing of the great American corporation and with the help of some of the best and brightest lawyers in American history, corporations have been fighting for equal rights for more than 200 years. Cases like Citizens United and Hobby Lobby are only the most recent chapters in a much older story. The story of what I've tried to suggest is a kind of corporate rights movement, maybe one of the most successful yet least known civil rights movements in American history. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Winkler. And now we'll have some questions and answers.
Sure, that's great.
Hang on, we have a hand up right
And
there.
water, too. Don't forget water.
How are the rights of unions different or the same as the rights of corporations?
Yeah.
In
Now,
these regards?
that's a great question, and one thing we often, one thing the court has often done in the past is link the rights of unions and corporations. So corporations were banned from making contributions to candidates. Unions were banned from making contributions from candidates to candidates. And the Citizens United case itself also said that its ruling applied to both corporations and labor unions. They both had the First Amendment speech rights of people essentially to go spend their money on elections. And so there's a way in which they're both equivalent, and I think some of the early, the reports on early financing of campaigns after Citizens United, that labor unions took advantage of the Citizens United loophole even more than corporations in those first years. I don't know if that's going to continue on, but that was what happened early on. What we are seeing, though, in the Supreme Court, though, is the tracks seem to be separating. So the Supreme Court has been busy expanding the rights of business corporations in cases like Citizens United, but not just that, because that also is unions, but Hobby Lobby saying corporations have religious freedom now, and Masterpiece Cake Shop, another religious freedom case, while at the same time the Supreme Court seems to be limiting the rights of labor unions. So just this past term, the Supreme Court, in a very important ruling, made it much harder for public employee unions to function and to operate, because they said that they can't require people who benefit from their negotiation but aren't members to actually make any contribution whatsoever to the union. So we are seeing the union's rights being limited in some ways and the corporate rights being expanded in other ways, but there's also tracks here where, like Citizens United, both unions and corporations won that right to spend their money on elections. Do you want me to call on people, or do you have a mic? Or I don't. Oh, you go. There's the mic. Oh, okay. I can't see very well up here.
We'll do
you know.
this one. Let's do that one and then this one.
Yes, there's another vortex in a corporation, and that is the shareholders. So you have a conflict between the corporation and the unions. You have a conflict between the unions, the corporation and the shareholders. And I would be interested to hear your comment about Chrysler v. Ford. That was a major decision of the Supreme Court on where are the rights of the shareholders in a corporation.
That's a great point. You know, the conclusion is the shareholders don't have a lot of rights to really run a corporation. Right? Your right is really to sell your shares. You can vote in elections, but the proxy mechanisms are such that you don't have a lot of say in most circumstances, only in extreme circumstances. But you do point out this really important case, right? It's Dodge Brothers versus Ford Motor Company. And just like the name says, it involves the Dodge brothers that went to have their own car fame. Well, the Dodge brothers were originally worked for Henry Ford. When he was rolling out his Ford company, they built the engines before spinning off their own car company. And Ford, the company was tremendously profitable, hugely successful in the 1920s. And Henry Ford decided that he wanted to share the wealth, not just with shareholders like the Dodge brothers, who were shareholders and who also made the engines and who had made just a total fortune because of their their investment in Ford Motor Company. All the shareholders had just made just boatloads of money. And so Ford says, you know what, I want to change the plan. I want to lower the price of the cars, even though we're going to put new features on them. I want to provide more benefits. I want, for my workers, higher salaries. I want to do all the stuff that will help the consumers and the employees and the public at large. His view was very capacious, that the corporation was successful and should be operated in the interest of all stakeholders. The Dodge brothers sued and won an important ruling in court where the court held that much of Henry Ford's plan to help all these other stakeholders was unlawful under corporate law and a violation of the corporate law of fiduciary duties, that executives have a duty to shareholders to maximize profit, at least in the long run. And ever since that Ford Motor Company case, the sort of corporation has been thought of, sometimes legally required, but almost always culturally understood to be really run for the interest of shareholders. We are seeing some pushback on some of that idea. Elizabeth Warren has come out with a proposal that you'd require co-determination, where labor would have representation on boards. I'm not sure any of that's going anywhere, but it's a really important moment in this history where corporations go from being entities where they could be capacious in their definitions of where their responsibilities lie to ones where they really have to focus on shareholder wealth, at least in the long run. You can make charitable contributions, you can, sponsor the symphony or whatnot, but you've always got to argue that in the long run, that's in the interests of shareholders.
We have a question back here.
What are our rights as listeners to hear the complete findings of the Mueller investigation, who we each have paid something to?
Now that's listeners' rights, right? That's what we got to hear. I don't think we have much of a right to get the Mueller investigation. I think there is some part of the report that by law is required to go to Congress. I don't know what's going to happen with that report. Predicting the future in the Trump era, forget about it. It reminds you that tea leaves are really best for making tea. Nothing else.
Thank you. I enjoyed your discussion of what's going on in the maybe not enjoying the direction, but nonetheless, in Europe or Canada, other countries' legal systems, are they going in the same direction? And if they are or are not, is there a discernible difference in the public response?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, there's some aspects of this idea of corporations having rights that is recognized elsewhere. So it's pretty uniform that corporations are recognized to have basic property rights. And in countries that have protections for property rights that say, like our Fifth Amendment that says you have to provide just compensation if your property is seized by the government for public use, a lot of countries have not necessarily those exact requirements, but similar property protections and requirements that you be compensated. And that's the kind of right that corporations traditionally are protected by around the world. What's different is the kinds of rights we're seeing the Supreme Court give to corporations in more recent years. This idea of political speech rights, religious liberty rights, those are spaces where we don't see a lot of similarities abroad. We don't see a lot of other countries giving business corporations a right to participate in their electoral politics by spending money on elections and things like that. Part of this is America has a much crazier campaign finance system than any other country you can pretty much imagine, in part just because we have such long elections, right? The fact that you got people now who are announcing their candidacy now, that's the problem. I mean, that's part of the problem. We need a campaign that runs like 6 weeks max. And, you get all your advertising in at one quick time, we can move on. But no, so it's not a common thing.
Yes, I understand there are movements to undo Citizens United, and I wondered what the strategies are being considered that might do that.
To overturn Citizens
Yes.
United? Yeah. Well, there's a couple strategies that are out there. I think actually that there was a strategy that was going to be almost foolproof in terms of how well it was going to work, and that was Hillary Clinton was going to win the 2016 campaign. So I think there's no doubt that Merrick Garland, had he been on the Supreme Court, would have been a fifth vote to overturn Citizens United. I have no doubt, and he would have voted to overturn Citizens. So you would have had the problem, to the extent that Citizens United is the problem, then that would have been overturned. I don't think it would have solved the problem of money in politics more generally. That's a bigger question. On the question of corporate rights in particular, if now the possibility of a Supreme Court opinion overturning it at least seems like it's much further off than it was, there is a movement to amend the Constitution. There is a push by a lot of big groups like Common Cause and Move to Amend to push for a 28th Amendment to the Constitution that would say corporations have no rights under the Constitution. That's a strategy that's being pursued. I think that strategy is a little risky, actually, as a strategy, because if it works, it might work too well, right? New York Times is a business corporation. CNN's a business corporation. Do they have no rights? Do we want to go back on, like, the Pentagon Papers case and say, oh, right, when that case comes up again, the Washington Post, they can be silenced because they're a corporation and they don't have any rights under the Constitution? Like, it might be just, you might do some harm along the way, too, in totally eliminating corporate rights.
Question here.
This is a two-part question. Who decides how the corporation spends its money for political contributions? And conversely, what do the shareholders have in terms of power to speak or vote their voice so the corporation speaks for them, not just for a few officials within the entity?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So what rights do shareholders have to really control corporate speech? Really not very much, right? I mean, we have corporate law today is designed to give and to concentrate authority to make decisions over how to spend the corporation's money in corporate management. Like, that's the whole nature of the beast, right? You own stock in plenty of corporations, and you have virtually, actually literally no say in anything that happens with those corporations. That's how the law's been designed, right? That we want corporations to take risks, and if they can make any kind of plausible claim that the money is being spent to help the business, then courts generally don't want to second guess that because they don't think they can have the kind of expertise. But the result is that they can make political expenditures and with the same discretion that they can choose whether to open up a store here or open up a store there. They have that broad discretion. And part of the irony, though, that comes out of this is, you remember Chief Justice Marshall's opinion in the Bank of the United States versus DeVoe case that I mentioned. And I said, remember, he didn't say that corporations are citizens, but he said their members are citizens. And to protect the rights of the members, the corporation has to have that right. Well, if that's the way you think about the rights of a corporation, that you got to think about that membership, well, then you got to think about shareholders. And one thing you might ask is, before a corporation speaks on a political issue, does it have the support, the genuine support of the shareholders, in a way that maybe might be more sincere or real than the ordinary corporate law presumption that, okay, management runs the business and does what it wants. But current law does not accept that. So currently shareholders have no rights to control corporate politics.
We have a question here.
Under the law, rights generally go with responsibilities. And it's my understanding that in the early days, when corporations were chartered by the state, they had to have some sort of social benefit that they were providing in order to be granted a charter. Where is that today? And the second part of that is, how do we put them and/or their members in jail when they commit crimes?
Well, that's a great question, right? I want to see Ronald McDonald in chains, you know. But no, seriously. You make but it's a very good point. I mean, with rights do come responsibilities, and at one point, corporations, as you say, your history is totally right. At the beginning of the founding years of our nation, corporations had to be chartered by the state government. The state legislature would have to pass a special act, basically pass a law that created a corporate charter. And generally, what you didn't have broad business regulation. You generally regulated a business by regulating it through its charter. You'd say it can only do this or can do that, or it can only raise this amount of money or charge this amount of money. You put it into the charter itself. And you couldn't get a charter unless you had some public benefit, that you were serving the public in some way, shape, or form. You know, building a bridge over a river, operating a turnpike or something like that. Like, you had to make some kind of contribution. And that dies, and it dies in chapter 3 of my book. Well, it dies. There's a Supreme Court case in 1819 brought by Daniel Webster, that legendary advocate, where he wins an important victory in the Supreme Court in a case involving Dartmouth College, which, although a college, an educational institution, was formed as a corporation. And when the state of New Hampshire tries to shut it down or reorganize it, Daniel Webster goes to the Supreme Court and wins a case that says New Hampshire can't regulate the Dartmouth College, can't take it over and reorganize it. And the big question in that case is, should we think of this entity, this corporate charter, this entity that's received a corporate charter by the state government, as a state entity, in which case the state can regulate it and do whatever it wants in the same way that the state can, I don't know, disband some agency of state government. It can do what it wants. Or is it a private entity, more like an individual with rights? And the court in that Dartmouth College case in 1819, that Daniel Webster case, says no, a corporation is private. It is does not need to have a public purpose. The public purpose is purely incidental to what a corporation does. And ever since then, corporations have really been on the private side of it. And that case, although it involved an educational institution, would set an important precedent that businesses would use for the next 40 years, saying, hey, the state's trying to regulate us, you're not allowed to. Like, we have our charter, you can't add any new regulation onto us. Oh, and jail. Yeah, it's hard to put people in. The idea of crime and the corporation is a difficult one. For most of human history, we've had corporations all the way back to 300 years before the birth of Christ. Ancient Rome, there were corporations. And by the way, the earliest corporations were polluting the world even back then. We have some of the first successful corporations were in ancient Rome 300 years before the birth of Christ. They were mining operations. And recent studies of ice core samples in Antarctica have found that from that period, evidence of global pollution caused by Roman mining corporations operating in Spain in 300 years before the birth of Christ. So corporations were a hazard to your health even from the get-go. And were doing things that might be thought of as crimes that would go in jail. But traditionally, corporations have not been held liable for crimes. Generally, it was thought that they weren't capable of having the evil intent that a crime requires. But that changed around the turn of the 20th century, when we developed the increasing prosecutions of corporations for crime, such as antitrust and things like that. One of the interesting things I tell a story is that in my book, there's these cases touch off when corporations suddenly become subject to criminal penalty. Corporations go to court and say, okay, well then we want the protections that the Constitution provides to criminal defendants. And most of the Bill of Rights is about criminal defendants, no unreasonable searches and seizures, right to due process of law, right to counsel, a right to a jury of your peers, no cruel and unusual punishments, right? That's all. And so they went to court and said, we've got those rights too. And the Supreme Court generally agreed with them and said, you're right. If you can be subject to criminal penalty, you get the same rights as a criminal defendant.
Thank you, Professor Winkler. I think you want to say something about money in politics and haven't really gotten into it. Is there evidence that money really is important in politics? We have some examples of that in the most recent presidential election went the other way, and maybe you could expand on that.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, this is America. What's money not important for? You want a good pizza, it takes a lot of money these days, right? So no, I mean, money is obviously super important in American elections because of the nature of our electoral system, where we have all of these elections, and their campaigns last so long with primary elections that happen 6 months before the general election. It makes no sense. It just creates these huge, lengthy campaigns that just fuel a demand for money because you got to finance your advertising. I think money in politics is a really significant problem in America, but it's a problem that goes beyond Citizens United. And I think sometimes when we think about Citizens United, we think of it as not just a case about the rights of corporations, but that a case that sort of symbolizes everything that's wrong with money in politics. And when people say, I want to overturn Citizens United, it's not clear whether they mean overturn Citizens United or scrap a system that runs on so exclusively on money. You know, currently with the current Supreme Court we have, it's not likely that any significant regulation of campaign finance is possible. The court would strike down any significant campaign finance laws right now. So right now I think we're kind of stuck with money in politics for a while.
But the last election went the other way. Hillary Clinton had.
Oh yeah, look, like anything in politics, money is not the only thing that matters in every case, and it's not political scientists would tell you that money in politics matters, but they would never say money is the one thing that determines everything. You know, the truth is that last election, the 2016 election, was totally unheard of because one of the candidates got thousands of hours of free television advertising, of free commercials, right? Well, he didn't have to spend money. Donald Trump didn't have to spend money on election ads. He was on the television all day, every day already. They covered every word he said. So I'm not sure that election, I think that election really is a very unusual one because of the nature of the candidate. If we see over the next 10 years that a consistent line where we see, you know, these elections are not won by the person who makes the most money, I think that it might really have a positive impact in encouraging people to spend less. Right?
Question over here.
Yeah. Does it seem a little odd to you, maybe your comment earlier relates to this, that basically these kinds of questions can be decided essentially on the basis by a group of 5 people, and who those 5 people are depends on which president and which happened to be in office when somebody previously died or retired or whatever, and which, you know, whether there was a senatorial majority or not. And then all of a sudden these kinds of what seem to be very largely political issues essentially get decided by, you know, a group of unelected, you know, 5 out of 9 justices.
Look, this is the perennial dilemma of the United States Supreme Court. Do we allow 5 unelected people who are totally unaccountable and not necessarily representative of America to make these decisions on these fundamental questions when the Constitution itself is kind of ambiguous? It doesn't really provide the answers that you'd like to have if you were going to empower judges. You know, at the same time, I think Americans have really come to appreciate the Supreme Court, even though the Supreme Court's made so many bad decisions over the years. I think that there's a sense that Americans have that there's a certain stability that's provided by a Supreme Court that can check the other branches of government. That even you take when the Supreme Court doesn't strike down a law, that somehow it still stabilizes. Like you had the Trump travel ban, and a lot of people, you know, that went to the Supreme Court. A lot of people were disappointed that the Supreme Court upheld the travel ban. But I think there's something about that whole long, slow process that actually sort of settled the issue a little bit. He ended up revising the ban several times, so it now applies to a small number of the people who had originally applied to. It's a much more tailored kind of ban in place, and that's because I think people have a certain faith that the court will be some kind of check on the other branches. I don't know whether it's really won that, rather it deserves that right. Certainly the story I tell in my book is that the Supreme Court is known as a protector of the vulnerable minorities, but it's used its power mostly to protect the powerful and the elite, and corporations are foremost among them.
We have that question over there, then a question here somewhere.
I kind of like this. I just walk to this side when there's a question over here. I kind of feel with this thing I should be like Dr. Phil, right? Sit and tell me.
So the question is, what is your opinion regarding the current declaration of emergency by the president, and what will ultimately happen to it?
I think we need to stay on subject about this
I'm happy to
topic.
talk about that, though. I don't
Okay.
mind. I'm a constitutional law
That's fine.
professor. This was the subject of dinner last night. I mean, come on. I'm happy to talk. I hate to disappoint those who really are big opponents of Donald Trump, but I think that's going to I think it's going to stand in court, the national emergency declaration. It's always hard to predict what happens in the future. You never know, but there's a plausible argument that that he's got the authority to do it, right? I think this is how it games out. That we've already got these lawsuits. The courts are going to go in, and the Trump administration is going to say, "Hey, look, Congress passed a statute, the National Emergencies Act. This National Emergencies Act gives the president specific legislative authority in a congressional statute to declare an emergency and to take funds that have already been allocated for certain purposes and redirect them." Right? It has in the law itself, it has no standard for how you determine an emergency. Right? It's just the president gets to declare a national emergency. This law has been used over 6 times in the 40 years it's been around. Obama had like 8 or 9 national emergencies he declared. I could get that number slightly wrong, but it was something like that. For all sorts of things, swine flu, sanctions against Gaddafi, and some other, this has been used by a lot of presidents for a lot of things, often in ways that don't even make the newspaper, the front page. And so when Trump's going to go to court, he's going to say to the court, he's going to say, look, they've given me this authority to use this. Presidents have used this authority time and time again, that no court has ever required the president to have some particular standard for what counts as an emergency, that the president genuinely believes there's a border crisis and genuinely believes that this is a major issue, even if the numbers are down, and that the court should not be second-guessing the president's determination of an emergency in the absence of Congress providing some clear standards for what counts as an emergency. I think that's how this case ends up at the end of the day. It might not. It could come out differently. It is just. I think it's a pretty plausible argument for him to be able to make. And so, while I think people are really upset about this national emergency, and there's certainly his statements that would call into question whether it's really an emergency, the Supreme Court in the travel ban case turned a blind eye to his statements about this being a Muslim ban. So, I'm not confident that they'll second guess his emergency declaration in the end.
In the 60 cases you talk about, has the president acted contrary to apparently the will of Congress in not funding the very thing that the president's trying to do?
This is actually one of the distinctions that those who are challenging the emergency declaration are going to make, because they're going to say that he hasn't done it, that it hasn't been done in an area where there's been a specific rejection by Congress, where Congress has not financed it. I think at the end of the day, that might not probably win the day for all of it, but there's at least some of the legislation that he's trying to reallocate money from. Some of the legislation has required, well, one of them in particular has a requirement that it not be on for money spent on something that Congress has refused to authorize. So some of the things that he's already promised to try to redirect, some of those challenges may succeed, actually, and that, he can't redirect those dollars, but not necessarily going to undermine, at the end of the day, the whole emergency declaration. That's my suspicion, anyway.
Professor Winkler, do you think that the issue with regard to the most recent notorious cases is a question of corporate personhood or some other issue, such as in Citizens United, the standard by which corruption or the appearance of corruption as the only standard is valid, or in Hobby Lobby, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act interpretation?
So can I just ask for clarification on the question? Is your question, well, so let me just clarify.
Is the problem really
corporate person?
Corporate personhood.
Got it. Thank you. No, I think the problem is not necessarily corporate personhood. Corporate personhood is a very long-established legal principle. If you go back to 1757, Blackstone, in his influential Commentaries on the Laws of England, considered one of the most influential law books ever, describes corporations as artificial persons. And the idea of a corporation as being an artificial person is not to say that a corporation is just like you and me existentially, right? Rather, the idea is a corporation is a person because a person is what the law recognizes as the kind of entity that can have rights and stand before the law. So corporate personhood is key for corporations to have the right to property and own that property in their own name, and a right to sue and to be sued, right? You can sue a corporation, right, because it's a person, because it has legal standing and identifiable, independent standing and identity before the law. That's why if you slip and fall at Starbucks, you can't sue the shareholders. You have to sue Starbucks, the corporation, right? The corporation is the one that has that legal responsibility. It has its own legal rights and duties. A key to corporate personhood in corporate law is that a corporation is its own independent entity, that it's not just a group of shareholders, and it's not about protecting the rights of shareholders, that the entity is its own entity, right, separate and apart from the shareholders. That's a principle that actually has been generally ignored in these corporate rights cases, that the Supreme Court has often said, like Justice Marshall did in the Bank of the United States case, not that a corporation at the end of the day was a person, but that a corporation was made up of people, and those people have rights, and you can use the corporation to protect them.
Actually, question here. Can you just address, in the absence of some of these cases, what would the situation look like? In other words, in the absence of the Dartmouth case, would that mean that the government can take over a private corporation? What are some of the ramifications had these cases gone the other way?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of these cases involve corporations that are fighting back against some kind of regulation, either a tax or some kind of law that prevents the corporation from doing something that it wants to do. And so these cases do two things, right? If they rule in favor of the corporation, they're allowing the corporation to do that thing they wanted to do and striking down that law. But not just affecting that corporation, but also affecting any other corporation that might be subject to that law, right? The effects are industry-wide, right? The law is struck down and every other business gets to benefit from it, right? So there are these extensive benefits that go across industries from any particular one victory by a corporation in court. And so that's really what, at the end of the day, that's what corporations are seeking. If corporations lost those cases, then the government would have more power to regulate businesses and regulate corporations. Whether the public would take advantage of that power or how that power would be exercised, I don't know. Would we be, I don't know, some socialist nation where private property doesn't exist anymore, or would we be pretty much the same with just some better regulation of corporations? I kind of tend to think it's probably more the latter than the former, but hard to know where we'd be if we didn't have all these rulings. Because part of the thing to understand is that America really has been run by business corporations. And the story that we often tell about corporate power is that corporations exercise that power in the political process by spending their money on elections, by lobbying, by getting friendly laws passed that help them and hurt us. But that's not the only way that corporations exert their power. And the story I've been trying to tell here is about how corporations have been able to use the courts and the Constitution, too, to expand their power. And an important site of understanding how corporations have solidified their influence in America and become so central to our economy and to our politics and to our lives is also about this exercise of power in the courts and through the use of the Constitution.
Question down there. Can you pass this down, please?
Thank you. This is a follow-up question to a previous question. What is your opinion of the proposal that tenure on the Supreme Court not be a life tenure?
There's a big push. I think it's one of the reforms of the Supreme Court that seems most likely, if any reform is likely, is the adoption of 18-year terms for justices rather than lifetime appointments. That's a good reform. I think that's a good idea. There's no reason for a justice to be appointed at the age of 50 now, as they are, and spend maybe 40 years on the Supreme Court. That just doesn't seem like that's necessary, right? We know that being a justice on the Supreme Court is a very isolating experience. You don't want someone who's done that for 40 years to be ruling on your case because they're so isolated from the world. So I think there's good reason to do that, 18 years. The advantage is that the idea of the 18-year terms is that you then space it out, and so every president would be dependable to be able to get an appointment onto the Supreme Court. There'd be one, every couple of years. I do think that that'll be one of the things that we see considered. If Democrats win control in the 2020 elections, they win the White House and make more headway at the Senate and retain the House, I think you're going to see a push for significant court reform. I think there's a lot of anger in Democratic circles right now about the stolen seat, as they're calling it, with regards to Merrick Garland and Neil Gorsuch, and then the way that Justice Kavanaugh was appointed and how that all sort of went awry, and that sort of poor investigation that was done afterwards. I think that there's going to be a lot of energy on thinking about how to respond to that. And 18-year terms is one thing that may come up. Court packing may be one of the things. Court stripping the jurisdiction of the court, not letting it rule on certain kinds of cases. I don't know that any of those things are likely to be adopted. I think that kind of structural reform is really difficult. We can't seem to get even the easy laws passed these days, much less the hard ones. But I do think there's going to be a lot of energy focused on those kinds of reforms.
We have time for one more question, I believe.
On the face of it, to me, the notion that corporations are people just seems absurd. They are much bigger. They have an indefinite lifespan. They've got much more money. On the other hand, you can't throw them in jail. You can't, there's limited things you can do to them. And when you think about a person competing against a corporation or trying to sue a corporation, it just seems like we're looking at such a tiny, people are so tiny compared to corporations, and to have them all under the same set of laws just seems nuts. So just a comment, I guess.
Right. You can just, like what we always say, like at faculty talks, we're always doing that. We don't want to actually ask a question, we just want to say something. And so we do that, and at the end they say, and what do you think about that? It's a question. It's a question. But look, that's a very good point, and it's true that if we're trying to think about the equality between corporations and ordinary people, there can be no equality, right? It's not possible. Corporations have this special legal ability to gather a tremendous amount of resources because of special advantages like limited liability that you just don't have unless you go form a corporation and try to raise a lot of money through that way. So corporations really are not equivalent to people. Like, we shouldn't think of them as whether we might say that corporations should have some rights sometimes, right? Property rights would be the kind of thing that maybe corporations should have. Maybe government shouldn't be able to, say, seize Google's campus up in Northern California without paying just compensation. And perhaps there's other rights that corporations should have, like a due process right. If we are going to say that corporations can be charged with crimes, then maybe we should say, like people, they should have a right to counsel and a right to challenge the charges made against them, right? But there are rights that they shouldn't have, and there are rights that are rights associated with personal liberty that don't make the same sense with corporations. And I think if we wanted to have a starting point, it's not the end point, but the starting point would be to go back to that Lochner era, where even though the court was very expansive on the rights of corporations in a whole bunch of wrong ways, I think the court was onto something when it said there's a difference between property rights and liberty rights, that corporations should have rights of property, but rights of liberty are the kinds of things that belong to natural persons, not artificial persons. And I don't think that answers every question that will arise, but I think it's a good starting place for every question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Winkler. Next month's colloquium will be on the subject of health care, and we will have Tom Rice, another professor from UCLA, who will be talking about foreign healthcare systems and compared to U.S. healthcare systems.